Many of you have been subject to the utter idiocy that has been comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler, whether it be in the New Republic's cover of him on the magazine, whether it be in the rhetoric of various pundits that happen to saturate the American political scene. But many of us, in assessing this idiocy, have not actually taken the time to understand that this idiocy is not only idiocy in the very literal sense, but it's also ignorance in the historical sense and the civilizational sense, because it is quite impossible for any American political figure to actually become Hitler. And this claim may seem outrageous to many of you, it may even seem unlikely, but that is perhaps the ultimate objection to using any comparison of Hitler and an American politician. And in this video, I'm going to actually walk you through why it is virtually impossible, if not incredibly unlikely, for an American figure to become Hitler, and then I'm going to tell you the implications of this outcome. Before we get into all that, my friends, hopefully you're doing well. I am Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to help us get our message out there, my friends. This is a channel for thinkers. This is a channel for people who are sick and tired of the drought of ideas that we have been experiencing in the discourse. And this is a channel for people that want to appreciate and understand American civilization on a much deeper level. And so if those things interest you, then I encourage you, please subscribe. If not, there's other channels that will fit your needs much better than mine. Thank you guys so much for being here. Now let's please enjoy the video. So, I have seen, and it's one of my big pet peeves, numerous Hitler analogies made in the political discourse, even beyond Donald Trump. People on both the left and the right, although most certainly recently it's been the left, and we'll get in that in a moment, have been so wont to invoke Hitler whenever they seek to tarnish the character of their political arguments. There's a few reasons for this. Number one, to most decent people, Hitler is the embodiment of the worst impulses of political authority and a reminder of what can happen in some context if that authority is not checked and reevaluated by the people who it is being applied to. And so instinctually, people will say, well, I want to just make you the embodiment of evil, and therefore I'll call you Hitler. But the response to this has not been strong enough. The response to this from most people has simply been, you're inspiring violence against Donald Trump, which I believe it certainly does, but that does not actually get to the core of why using Hitler as any comparison in the American context is ultimately foolish. And so I intend to make that case here, that there can be no American Hitler. Now, let me be very clear before I continue. This does not mean there cannot be an American authoritarian, or that authoritarianism cannot come to America. Not only can authoritarianism come to America, it already has come to America. And in fact, we're going to look at some instances of American authoritarianism, but the character and the form and the application of American authoritarianism is fundamentally different from that of the Third Reich. So, how can I be so confident in asserting that America could never have a Hitler-like figure? Very simply, because I understand the civilizational pillars, the ideological pillars that gave rise to Hitler in the first place. My friends, nothing happens in a vacuum. This is a world led and guided by ideas. Now, when I say ideas, I don't mean the ideas themselves literally guide the world. I have to make this distinction because some people literally believe that ideas themselves guide the world and we are just subjects to them. This will be the belief one people are going to address today in the video. But I must say, people with ideas guide the world and push forth us into different epochs of history. And so the rise of a particular political figure in a country must be evaluated within the context of A, the civilizational ideas that were permeating his time, and B, the contemporary issues that also permeated his time. If you were to assess the presidency of Donald Trump, or why he came into office, you cannot ignore the 30 plus years of the sort of conservative consensus in regards to fighting communism. After that had been achieved, there was really nowhere else to go, and the neocons took over, hijacked, and applied American efforts and energy towards terrorizing the world. Donald Trump was a reaction to that, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people in the intelligence community hate him. Different story, different day. But similarly, You can't look at the rise of Hitler and not understand the ideological backdrop that brought him forth. There were three pillars of German civilization at that time that brought rise to Hitler: Hegelianism, Prussianism, and Volk. I'll say it again: Hegelianism, Prussianism, and Volk. I will briefly go through each of these notions and concepts in a moment. But it's very important to understand what I mean, the historical backdrop. So the German Empire, the Imperial Germany, which is called Prussia, lasted for a century and a little bit more time after that, from the 1701 to the 1900s. And when it fell in the 1900s, what immediately happened thereafter was the radical transformation of Germany, the rise of the Weimar Republic, which when that collapsed came the Hitlerian dictatorship of the Nazis that characterized the 30s to the 40s. And so the ideas before the rise of Hitler were Hegelianism, Prussianism, and Volk. So, Hegelianism. So Friedrich Hegel is a philosopher that many of you have probably heard of. And Friedrich Hegel had a lot of very odd and strange ideas. But his primary idea that's very particular here is his notion of freedom, and how his notion of freedom actually influenced how Germany operated. Hegel believed that freedom was not this thing that you experience on an individual level. In fact, he had a very mystical idea of freedom. He said his idea of freedom was actually totalitarian, because he believed, as a famous author once said, that in order to be free, you must experience something greater than yourself, and you must give yourself over to something greater than yourself to achieve ultimate consciousness. Well, what was this thing that was greater than yourself? Or what Hegel said in his own words, he said a self-comprehending totality in order to achieve the consciousness of freedom. This thing was the government. I will quote Karl Popper, a prominent philosopher of the 20th century, actually quotes Hegel's thoughts on this particular issue. Popper says, for example, in his quotations of Hegel, that Hegel said, quote, "The state is the divine idea as it exists on earth. We must therefore worship the state as the manifestation of the divine on earth. The state is the march of God through the world. The state must be comprehended as an organism. To the complete state belongs, essentially, consciousness and thought. The state knows what it wills. The state exists for its own sake. The state is actually existing realized moral life." So for Hegel, if you're going to be free, you must be a willing pawn of the state. And more broader than that, you must be a willing pawn of the sort of divine idea that the state represents on the earth, but actually encompasses all of history. This goes into Hegel's idea of history as well. Hegel believed that history was this thing that acted on people. People didn't act on it. It was this conscious idea that moved people into certain phases of their development, certain phases of their freedom, and eventually thrusted them into a particular political order that Hegel believed was the pure embodiment of freedom. And this leads right into Prussianism, because Prussianism was what Hegel believed was the ultimate stage of human development that reflected total and perfect freedom, particularly the reign of Kaiser Wilhelm. I will quote here from an article about Hegel. This says this: "In Hegel's homeland, Prussia, ordinary citizens gained certain rights, such as freedom of movement and property, and offices of the state were open to qualified citizens. But the parliament was weak, most people had little or no say in government, and the king could impose strict censorship. Despite these restrictions, Hegel believed that freedom is best nurtured through a constitutional monarchy. The monarch, in this case Friedrich Wilhelm III, embodies the spirit and desires of the governed, who now have become free. Hegel thus declares his own Prussian society as the final stage of development in the consciousness of freedom." Now, in Prussia, the censorship was so bad that even Karl Marx, as a young man, wrote a missive against the censorship in Prussia because it was so bad, and he himself was attacked and censored by the Prussian government. People were jailed for criticizing the crown. Now, Prussia was not simply a reflection of Hegel's beliefs. Prussia also had its own beliefs. The historian Oswald Spengler, who had a very similar idea of history and human activity that Hegel did, Spengler believed that history also controlled people, and that every civilization was going towards this ultimate terminal point that would be the end of all history. You'll notice with these people, they think in very broad, abstract ideas that have very little application to the real world, but inspire a kind of fantasy in the mind that moves people towards particular behaviors. We should all evaluate what moves us towards doing what we are doing, because it's not always reason, as it should be. But Spangler said, he defined Prussianism as the following, quote, "The German, or more precisely Prussian instinct was, power belongs to the whole. The individual serves it. The whole is sovereign. The king is only the first servant of his state. Everyone has his place. He is commanded and he obeys." Prussia was a society built on militarism and aggression, built on the centralization of power, and built on a sense of duty towards the king, and built on essentially seeing the king as the divine fulfillment of the history and meaning of the world. That was Prussianism. And that was the reign, unfortunately, whose ideas were exported over into America in the form of our current education system, where education was said not to exist for the sake of the pupil, but for education's sake. You see, everything has to be detached from an individual context to go towards some broader idea where it can then be played with by these intellectuals without actually being able to apply to reality as it is. So if Hegel said freedom is being a slave to the state, and then Prussianism says the king embodies what it means to be free, that then therefore means that German civilization for those many, many years was based on obedience to authority, arbitrary authority, and a divine worship and idolatry of the king. Now the Volk kind of tied this all together, because the Volk is this German notion that German people are a race insofar as they have a unique place in history, a unique place in their genealogy, and some thinkers have attributed different things to this. Hitler took this racial notion of the German people and he used it and he filled it in with his weird theories about human identity, his weird theories about the Aryans. You know what the term the Aryans? That's the Volk idea. And he used this to inspire mass hysteria and ignorance within the people. Hannah Arendt herself even admits that Hitler took a symbol, a single-fied idea of the world, imposed it upon the people, and the people then therefore went along with his destruction and machination. If you ever wonder why Hitler was able to get away with evil, it's because the people were blinded to evil because they saw a reflection of their civilization, supposedly, in what that person was doing, even though it was the opposite of what was morally pure. So, if Prussianism, Hegel, and Volk were the backdrop that Hitler used to rise to power, what is the backdrop of American virtue? The backdrop of American virtue, my friends, is natural law, reason, and the individual. It's the new world, the idea that the individual is an embodied conscious being with rights and responsibilities and the ability to reason, versus the old world, the idea we just heard that history acts upon you, that the king is divine, that structures and bloodlines and castes move you, you don't move yourself, and they have dominion over you. That is what America is. Max Lerner actually talks about this. And he defines what I'm trying to say better than anyone else has in modern history in his book, America as a Civilization, where he says, and I quote, he calls what brought America to rise the freedom property complex. He says the freedom property complex has dominated American thinking throughout the nation's history. It managed to combine the strongly mystical intensity of the 17th century thought with the deism of the 18th century, the world of transcendence with that of the rationalism. To the deeply religious, it offered the nourishment of belief. To the skeptical and the rationalist, it offered secular sustenance. To the 19th century mind, it made possible the linking of social progress with individual freedom. For the rationalist, it provided a mystique by which freedom, capitalism, and individualism combined to explain the success of the American experiment. He goes on to say, and I quote, "Thus was formed a pattern woven of individualism, Puritanism, conscience, vocation, the allegory of martyrdom, the belief in natural rights, the passion for freedom, and the clinging to property. Within it, there have been swings of emphasis, cycles of thought moving spirally in response to the needs and changes of American life." So, that's America. America is a fundamentally different civilization from much of Europe, and most certainly from Germany. And that is why a Hitler figure cannot rise, because there is no backdrop. There is no single American stock or race he can appeal to rise to. There is no single overarching idea of history where the individual must be a willing slave to the government that he can appeal to. In fact, the exact opposite is the DNA of the American tradition. But that does not mean that American authoritarianism cannot rise. Let's talk about someone in history called Huey Long. Huey Long was the person that could have been FDR. He could have been even worse than FDR. He was the governor of Louisiana back in the 20s and 30s. And Huey Long was essentially a socialist despot who managed to galvanize the masses by appealing to grievance and by appealing to moral ignorance and by appealing to the worst conditions, all three things socialism does in spades. And he had a program called the Share Our Wealth program. Now, the Share Our Wealth program was an idea that Huey Long proposed. And this idea involved, I quote, massive spending, a wealth tax, and wealth redistributionism. Huey Long constantly, like many socialists today, villainized the millionaires and billionaires and the rich of his day for political capital. And Huey Long had no problem expanding his authority as governor, and even when he left the governorship of Louisiana and became a United States senator, basically blackmailing and controlling his successor to do whatever he wanted. He was a grade A authoritarian. And yet, look at his appeals. His appeals were not to the vote, to the master race, were not to some civilizational emphasis on militarism or whatever. No, his appeal was to the downtrodden individuals who still had an idea that their lives and the lives of the government were separate things. But in his formulation, he believed the government could help their lives along. And so he appealed to that. He twisted a uniquely American notion, the separation between the family and the people and the individual and the government, and then shoehorned that into sustenance for his agenda. An American authoritarian is not going to be like Hitler. An American authoritarian is going to be precisely like an American in a skin suit. But beneath that skin suit, there will be a evidence of sickness. There will be ideological rot. There will be evidence of moral decay. There will be so many things that go against the DNA of America, but it'll never be like Hitler. An American Hitler is impossible because there is no prerequisite in our civilization for an American Hitler to rise. So on Trump, you can't tell me that someone who spends his entire political career advocating for a return for America's foundational ideas, whether he does it perfectly or not is not the case here, is Hitler, or even an American authoritarian for that matter. You can't tell me that someone who during his first term in office quite literally downsized the regulatory state, which is the prerequisite of an authoritarian takeover and actually is a concept brought to us by the Prussianism that I just talked about, you can't tell me that that person is an American Hitler. You can't tell me that someone that quite literally de-emphasizes militarism and emphasizes peace and diplomacy is an American Hitler. He has none of the component parts that would even make him an American authoritarian, much less an American Hitler-like figure. And so for everyone who is ignorant of philosophy, ignorant of history, who is just plain damn ignorant, I must implore you, please, pick up a book, confront your priors, reject your false premises, so that this 24-year-old guy on the internet does not have to spend so much time walking through what should be obvious to any American that knows and learns his history. Until then, my friends, I think it is up to us as thinking people to embody the spirit of our founders and keep our discourse smart alive by learning things, studying history, studying philosophy, knowing our civilization, and then applying those principles whenever these disputes arise. No, Trump is not Hitler. Hitler will not come to America. If a dictator comes to this country, he'll look just like you and me, but on the inside, he'll be the exact opposite of what he should be. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can to get our message out there. I am so excited, my friends. We're almost to 20,000. Thank God. I'm so excited. Thank you guys so much for being here on this journey with me. Thank you so much for hearing my thoughts, for wanting to learn philosophy. I appreciate it. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.